Thank you so much for joining me here. My name is Julie Lanford, and I am the Community Engagement Director at Cancer Services Incorporated. We are a local community-based nonprofit agency in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and we exist to help enhance health, life, and survivorship. And today we are doing an expert interview, one of our series that we have, and we're very grateful for such great experts we have access to in our local area. So our topic today is the role of clinical trials, and we're going to talk through some of the ways that questions you might have or ways that you can be involved in some research and to help inform the future of cancer care and cancer survivorship. So our expert speakers today are Kirby, who's a PharmD who has retired but spent a lot of time managing clinical trials, directing clinical trials. We also have Dr. Katherine Ansley, who's a medical oncologist from Atrium Health, and Dr. Kathleen Elliot, who is a medical oncologist from Novant Health. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining and being our experts today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So let's kind of start just with the basics. And we obviously need to define what is a clinical trial. And then beyond that, if one of you, we'll say Gray, we'll have you kind of do our definition of clinical trials. And then we'll let each of you share a little bit about your experience with clinical trials professionally and what made you interested in kind of joining with this discussion today. So Gray, tell us, what is a clinical trial?
So a clinical trial is a research study that involves patients or survivors. Um, it's not a lab experiment. It's directly as far as affecting patients. It could be quality of life assessments. It could be post-treatment. How are you doing? Or it could be something that's really innovative, like brand new treatments for certain types of cancers. It's broad. There's a bunch of clinical trials that are done regionally as well as nationally. And it's an innovative way to get new treatments or to educate the world about what's going on with you and your cancer, or to bring new treatments that aren't currently available to others.
Yeah, I think a lot of people kind of know, oh, there's a lot of new drugs now for cancer treatment that are better than, they used to be. Treatments are different now. People are surviving a lot longer, but don't always understand that whole process. So, Dr. Ansley, what has your experience been professionally with clinical trials?
I think that's a really important point. I mean, every new cure or drug that we have developed in the last 50 years has come through a clinical trial, essentially. So the way that we find more treatments and more cures is thanks to, the brave volunteers, especially with these drug trials that we're mentioning for cancer. The original chemotherapy drugs that are now 50 plus years old, we have a lot more targeted therapies now that have come through and are more personalized medicine. And so you might qualify for a clinical trial based on, certain specifics of your type of cancer. That might get you access to a new drug 10 years before it's available on the market. I think one of the most important things with clinical trials is to understand that no matter what, you're still going to be receiving standard of care at a minimum. I think sometimes people are scared that they would go on a clinical trial and get a placebo as a cancer patient, and that's not true. We have plenty of ethics committees and things like that that help us make sure that what you're getting as a minimum is the current standard of care in our country, but we're also just trying to beat that and do better and better by discovering. And that's with the drug trials. But as Gray mentioned also that, we have a lot of studies that are focused on quality of life and symptom management. So it might not just be a new drug, but it's how do we make this current medicine or situation better? How do we have something that has less nausea, or how do we have something that causes less fatigue, less, chemo fog or cognitive effects? So that's really important too.
Thanks. Yeah, it's funny because I'm a dietitian by training. So in school, when we studied oncology, they were like, oh, there's going to be so much taste changes and so much nausea. And then I started working in oncology and I was like, gosh, like people's nausea is really managed quite well. And it's,
Yeah.
but things get better because I guess patients either give feedback and that informs trials, or, just trying to make the process better and more effective. So, Dr. Elliot, how about you? What's your experience with clinical trials professionally?
So clinical trials has always been for oncology sort of a backbone of our care. We know as a profession that we can always do better in terms of our patient outcomes. There's no cancer that we treat right now where we can say it's 100% cure. And I think because of that, that drives us as a profession to want to get better outcomes for our patients. And so um, just as a part of our sort of um, profession that sort of drives our desire to engage in clinical trials because, as you said, just taking your example of nausea, I think one of the most pivotal studies that we've had for oncology care was Zofran. Like, if you read up on before Zofran, most of our chemotherapy had to be done inpatient because of intractable nausea and vomiting. And I think I remember one pharmacist mentioned about how he was a part of the trial and he had to record the amount of vomit patients had before Zofran. But since Zofran is now approved, it transitioned treatment from being inpatient to outpatient. And so, again, making the experience better for patients and on the search for better outcomes has sort of driven oncology as a whole into participating in clinical trials, I think, more than any other area of medicine.
Yeah, so that's interesting because then that would be like for the Zofran example, that's not a cancer treatment drug, but it's a drug that's super helpful in
Yes,
getting people to tolerate their treatments, to have a better kind of experience, because who wants to be, admitted or whatever when you could, go get treatment and go home.
correct.
So all different types of clinical trials. So how would somebody go about finding a clinical trial? Like, I'm thinking there's a couple of scenarios. One is someone's newly diagnosed and they are like, oh, I want to make sure I'm getting the most sort of cutting edge treatment. I would like to participate in clinical trials if at all possible. How does somebody go about finding one?
I think the best place to start with that is, by talking to your oncologist first and foremost. They're going to be most informed on your care and the specifics, things that are available in your area, whether they have a clinical trial at their site or know of, oftentimes I'll refer to other sites in our area if they have a trial open that we don't. But for patients, the best place to look is clinicaltrials.gov. It's run through our National Cancer Institute, and it has an up-to-date list of all the different, and you can kind of put in what you're looking for in terms of if you're a new diagnosis, a stage one new breast cancer, or if you've been dealing with breast cancer for a few years now and trying to figure out, I've been through a few lines of treatment. Are there any other treatment lines available that are being studied? And you can kind of put your specifics in there. So that's a great resource with clinicaltrials.gov. But definitely starting with your local team and your local oncologist, they're going to be the most knowledgeable on what's available in your area.
Yeah, I would second that, clinicaltrials.gov. Sometimes that can be intimidating for patients and sort of just having that conversation with your oncologist. And then other resources or advocacy like disease-specific organizations, so like the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, going straight to the Breast Cancer Foundation. They can sometimes have more sort of targeted trials for sort of disease specific if clinical trial seems to be a little bit overwhelming. And then, as Dr. Ansley said, getting a second opinion in another major medical center can open access to trials that are not available locally. So some of the big centers like MD Anderson or um, Sloan Kettering are examples of where you can go abroad to get access to other trials.
You know, your MyChart account has a clinical trials button you can look on, as well as some of the local hospitals' websites will have it. And then when you do it in clinicaltrials.gov, you put a zip code range and how many miles you are from your location and how far you're willing to travel. So it really helps as far as trying to figure out what's going on. And it can be overwhelming. Just, if you're looking for something current, make sure you check currently active trial, and then you'll just see the ones that are going. You won't see all the old ones.
No, I think
So,
that's a great point. It's even overwhelming for me a little bit of times. I think that's where technology is going to be in our favor too. We have a new program, and I'm sure a lot of other hospitals are too, called Lend AI. It's an AI specific to helping us find clinical trials. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's helping us screen patients' charts for studies that are open, at our institution and at other institutions too. So hopefully that we're going to get better and better at that in the future of finding trials and using technology to help us do that as well.
yeah, so that's what I was kind of gonna ask is like, how actively would like a medical oncologist be seeking out clinical trials for any particular patient? Like, is it if the patient seems interested, or if there's something you're currently enrolling for, or is that just a standard like thing that you all do when you meet with patients is to look for clinical trials?
I think Dr. Elliot said it great earlier is that, the field of oncology, probably more than any other field in medicine, relies on clinical trials. We are very pro in our national guidelines all support being able to offer a clinical trial to every patient if possible, because we think that is how we move the field forward. It's how we've developed so many new treatments and drugs and are trying to get to that cure. So I treat breast cancer, and that's my area of specialty. And personally, my goal for our institution is to have a study open for every kind of possible scenario in breast cancer for those patients who are early stage 1, 2, and 3, that are either driven by estrogen or HER2 positive, and then also in the metastatic stage 4 patients. I want to have options for all of our patients there. I think that's probably where it's most important, because those are the ones that right now, we can't yet cure. And so I would hope to have one open but that's not always the case, at every institution. We try to have one for each scenario where they're getting at least, like I mentioned, the standard of care. But sometimes that might be with the supportive care type trials that we discussed. For example, like in our stage 1 breast cancer patients, most of them are just going to have the surgery and be put on an anti-estrogen pill. But we have one study in that situation that's looking at exercise and breast cancer patients who are on the anti-estrogen pills to see if that helps cause less joint pain from those pills, because that's a big potential side effect. So some of them might be supportive care type things like that, like diet and exercise after breast cancer treatment to help reduce, recurrence or reduce side effects. So
And
Yeah,
I think I was just going to add, as Dr. Ansley said, it's a conversation that we try to have with all of our patients. And it sometimes takes a lot of education about sort of the process of clinical trials, because, as a part of a patient's healthcare journey before they see me, like if they go to their doctor and they have high blood pressure, the doctor talks to them about putting them on this one med that's been in production for how many years. And so they're going to go with the tried and true. And so with oncology care, it's a little bit different because sometimes the newer drugs are the ones where we get the most benefit. And so it sort of takes a little bit of education about, while this drug has been on the market, sometimes standard of care has been on the market for a long time, the outcomes may not be as good as we would like, but if you're exposed to this medication, um, then there is the possibility that you can have an even better outcome. So it does take sort of an education of sort of walking patients through why they would benefit from a clinical trial, because up until that point, the journey of their healthcare has been a little bit different.
yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting because there's been a lot of learning in clinical trials, I guess. Gray, did you start as a practicing pharmacist, and then like how did you transition into clinical trials as a career?
Yeah, so back when I got my PharmD degree, I did a clinical training in critical care and cardiology. And at that time, they offered a fellowship in clinical research and drug development. And I worked on new drugs related to clot busters and that kind of thing. And then I was part of the AIDS clinical trials group. We did febrile neutropenia trials at Wake Med Hospital, that kind of thing. And then two physicians and I started to doing clinical trials in the private practice in Raleigh. And I did that for a good bit of time and then eventually got out of that and started working for small biotechs. In the last 15 years, I've been working on innovative cancer therapies where we take a compound from the lab, we write a protocol, we run the trial, we look at the results and see whether we can make the next steps with those drugs. That's what I've been doing. So the last 15 years, I've been working in oncology research.
So I feel like, in the US, we're kind of proud of our way of, developing new treatments and that, okay, we've got like cutting edge treatments and that kind of thing. We haven't always maybe had the best ethical standards in terms of experimentation. And so I know we hear from, the public sometimes that they're concerned or that they've heard passed down from generation to generation, like I don't want to be experimented on and that type of thing. How do you all, like it's very common, and of course we understand, like you wouldn't want to be experimented on. I feel like all of you have spoken to that the clinical trials would be adding on to the standard of care. That wasn't always how things were done, I guess, but we've developed some safeguards in place around clinical trials. I feel like the people who are involved in clinical trials are very passionate about that too. So I'm curious from each of you, kind of how do you like explain that to somebody who's hesitant or concerned about the process, like in terms of safety and when somebody, feels comfortable enrolling in a trial?
So the history is very real, and especially I experienced it, the hesitation of clinical trials with African Americans, especially with the case of the Tuskegee syphilis study, where Black men were deceived and denied treatment for decades. And then there's also unethical experiments that happened after World War II. And so I think those studies did some harm. And so people come in with that history, and it has to be acknowledged that that was done, but that's not how things are done now. There, because of those situations, we've learned a lot, and there's been a lot of safeguards that have been put in place to make sure that things happen safe in a safe way. There's more transparency about what has happened, and there's more advocacy groups that are involved to make sure things like that don't happen again. And so, for when I come across patients that acknowledge that or bring that up, I acknowledge that and sort of share with them the things that have been done and the safeguards that are in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think patient safety is always our top priority now, and always should be. The first rule of a doctor is do no harm, is my perspective. And so I'm always concerned with the safety of any study. Most of these studies they take years to develop. They start as, especially the drug studies that people would potentially enroll in. They've started at first they studied them in mice, and then they had the first in-human studies with very, very small, limited number of patients in a phase one and then a phase two. And by the time it kind of gets to the bigger trial of phase three, they've already been through these smaller studies to make sure they are safe. And now they're just trying to make sure that they're just as effective, if not better, than the currently available treatment. But you can, rest assured that if you are going to your doctor at either hospital or anywhere, that you'll have what's called an informed consent process. So every single study has a principal investigator who's assigned to that site who has taken the trial through sort of a rigorous process with a institutional review board or an IRB, and they're an independent a board that looks over in crazy detail to make sure that the study is safe. And then that principal investigator is ultimately responsible for the safety, but you always have the opportunity to, like I said, ask questions. And when they go through the informed consent process with you, it's not just like, here, sign this paper. I mean, it is a really long visit most of the time where you meet with the research nurse and the staff to explain all the possible risk and benefits. You should have time to ask questions. And most importantly, it's a voluntary thing. No one is ever being forced into it. You can leave at any time. I always tell my patients when they're going on a study, of course, we want you to participate because we think this is how we move the field forward. But it is no matter what, it's not going to change my care of you. I'm going to treat you no matter what. And with whether that's with the standard of care or on this study, we're going to be here for you. It's your choice. And if you decide at some point that for whatever reason to come off the study, that's always an acceptable choice as well.
There's also the large institutions have scientific review boards that actually look at those, but before they actually go to your IRBs, and they look at the scientific rigor of the trial and make sure it fits the local institution and the local population. There's multiple safeguards that there weren't there 60 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm on some review board that also looks at like results throughout the trial, right? So that and I know of nutrition trials that have been done that have actually been stopped early if reviewers find that there's an outcome that's happening too often. And they
Yeah,
say,
that's
you
right.
know
They
what?
have certain benchmarks they have to
Yeah,
meet
let's
along the
end it.
way. And if they're not meeting those benchmarks, if they ever feel like the risk might be outweighing the benefits, they stop the study
Yeah.
early.
And then the opposite can happen. They could see so much benefit that they
Right.
stop the trial. They could potentially take that application and go to the FDA and do an expedited review and maybe get that drug on the market faster and to patients.
And sometimes they have crossovers where those patients who were in the standard of care arm can then go ahead and still get
Right.
the experimental arm early because they saw how well it was working. So even if you don't get randomized to the exciting new treatment right away, there still may be an opportunity to get that in the future.
I feel like that's always like the people who are kind of like, I want the cutting edge, I want to
Yeah.
participate in research, I want to, make a difference and give back with my experience. And then it's like you get assigned to the like placebo arm. Or, sometimes you don't know which arm you're in. You're like, I
Yeah,
don't
or
want
standard
that.
of care, not necessarily placebo, but like
Right,
standard of
yes.
care. Yeah, exactly.
Like, no, I want the extra arm. So it's yeah, I hear a
I
lot of
have the
talk about like,
opposite situation with one clinical trial right now. We're always looking for more drugs, but we also want to de-escalate when appropriate too. So, we want to find drugs that work better and better, but sometimes we also don't want to give too much. And we have a current clinical trial open right now in patients who have estrogen positive breast cancer. And it's actually looking at not giving the chemo of the past, which is the current standard of care. And it's called Offset, this study. And maybe we can just get away with just the anti-estrogen pills in these, young women, and they don't necessarily need that really intense chemo anymore. And so that's a harder talk because so many people want to be as aggressive as possible and get that chemo. And it's more like, no, I don't know that we necessarily need that anymore. Our newer drugs are so good. So that de-escalation is important as well in oncology. We want to give just the right amount of treatment, but not too much. And trying to find that balance is important.
yeah, it's hard. I participated in a trial once, like with my GYN office. It feels like, there's all different types of trials. And I was like, I'm doing this for the good of womankind. And then the whole process of doing it, and I was like, I can't keep this up. So I was a dropout. But I also
I mean, it is
told,
a commitment for sure.
yeah,
I work patients on that, and they try to ease that burden some. Like they're not going to pay you to be on a clinical study, right? Because that would probably be unethical for certain studies. But sometimes they
right.
can give you a gas card because they do recognize you're getting extra. You might have an extra visit or two, and so being able to pay for your parking or gas or some of the clinical trials through our pharmaceutical companies will even pay for your childcare while you have, so there are things like that that you can ask for that are still appropriate that wouldn't, cause bias with the study.
Yeah, so I think that leads into a really good question, which is how are all these trials paid for? Because I know like some of our clients, they are trying these new drugs, or they're enrolled in clinical trials that are in other parts of the country, and the clinical trial is like paying for their travel sometimes, or and of course like helping with their treatments, maybe their insurance covering the standard of care, and then the trial is covering some of the extra costs. So who pays for this? Great, in your business, I'm assuming you're funding lots of trials, the trials that go well and the trials that come out with maybe nothing, but like how is all of this paid for?
So the sponsorship of trials can come from various places. It can come from drug companies or biotechs. It can come from national groups like the NCI, SWOG, and that kind of thing. But with drug companies, we give a grant to the local investigators like Dr. Ansley and Dr. Elliot and have them run the trial for us. And our goal is it's not going to be any extra cost for the patient. We want, support their transportation, things that they need. They won't get paid to be in the trial as you do in like an infectious disease trial or that kind of thing. But your cost, as far as being in the trial, we encourage the local investigators to pay for. And that's what we want it to be easy for the patients to come in for the trial.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that developing a new drug for cancer, sometimes can cost millions and even $1 billion. It is very expensive to take something from the laboratory on mice, a new drug, to through that phase one, phase two, phase three study. And so sometimes these pharmaceutical companies really are incredibly helpful at being able to fund that research. But one of the most important things to me is as the investigators to not have any bias towards that. We always disclose our conflicts of interest for a reason. If and we don't, as the PI, principal investigator at an institution, don't get paid directly by the drug company. That money that we accept is truly just for the research itself. It would pay for the extra CT scan you might need that's not covered by your insurance, or if you need an extra biopsy, it's paid for that. But it's very important to us as clinical investigators that we don't have any bias, and it's a key component of doing research. And sometimes the trials are randomized for that reason, where we're blinded. So even I, as your doctor, might not know, which medicine you're on. One time I had a trial open with different anti-estrogen pills, and we didn't know which one they were necessarily getting until they started telling me about the side effects they were having. But the reason we do that is to keep it as safe as possible and unbiased as possible. We don't want there to be any kind of bias in that situation.
So it's like there's some funding comes from pharmaceutical companies that put a lot of money into research. Not all of it results in an actual medication, but they're making profits. So some of their profits are funding new trials. Is that right? But then there are trials that are funded, like NIH is the National Institutes of Health, and they're grant funded research trials to maybe discover things that is not a pharmaceutical.
Correct. I mean, there are plenty of that are not pharmaceutical through the NIH. They also have some drug studies through NIH as well, though. And then, as Gray mentioned, cooperative groups are really helpful. Things like SWOG and in
What
the
is SWOG?
that's the Southwest Oncology Group here in
Okay.
our area. Um, and these groups get together and have their own, it's a group of doctors that get together and say, like, I have an idea for a study. And they kind of get together, and all these different hospitals are able to open the study and fund it that way through different kind of grants. Of course, like the Susan G. Komen Foundation. So there are specific
Gotcha.
foundations that also support research funding. And so in breast cancer, that's a big one that you can apply. I, as an investigator, could say, I have an idea. For example, that exercise study I mentioned, that's not funded through a pharmaceutical company. It's funded actually through the NCI. But we said, we really think if we can get patients to do these specific exercise a couple times a week with a health coach, that they would have less side effects from this medicine. And so they supported that study, and it's open and paid for, that way through the government. So they're independent foundations and the government, pharmaceutical, a lot of different avenues for funding.
Yeah. So let's think about like how, because we've talked about like, patients are just regular people. You can look on clinicaltrials.gov for all kinds of trials. Could be overwhelming, but you can also go to sort of your specific cancer type, maybe advocacy group, and find out what might be available there. Um, what about any local initiatives? I think if some people are just really interested in clinical trials or they like to inform research, what are some areas that maybe like can they be involved in generating new ideas?
Usually through
Absolutely.
their advocacy groups, usually is how you generate new ideas. Why am I getting hot flashes all the time from my pills I'm taking for breast cancer? How can you help this? What new things can we do? It's usually the patient advocacy groups can really help us get new ideas to bring better care to patients.
Yeah, and I think there are some like review committees where they want patient involvement, right?
And
And
then
so,
our IRB, for example, the committee that approves every single study that opens, does now have a patient on it who is someone who is not, in the medical field. But I think it's so important to have that patient advocate can look at the study from the perspective of the patient and not just from the science, and say, you call this side effect potentially tolerable as a grade 2, but maybe I don't think grade 2 diarrhea is tolerable as a patient. Like, is that things that we could maybe think about, that to you, that's only 3 or 4 loose bowel movements a day. And maybe that's not that big of a deal. But for me as a patient, that is a very big deal. And we do need them to speak up and say, like, no, no, that is not tolerable. I don't want that potential risk. Have we thought about that from the patient perspective? So
right. So yeah, if people are interested, if you've made it through this whole interview and this is so fascinating to you, I think there are local opportunities and potentially opportunities nationally through either, pharmaceutical groups or research institutions where you can be involved in providing feedback and things like that. And I will say they are looking, I think the patient perspective is increasingly being like recognized and valued for that lived experience and kind of getting outside of the research frame of mind and, the patient experience frame of mind. So I know we're wrapping up our time, and this has been really, I think, really interesting. I'm so grateful for the three of you for joining me today, for sharing your expertise, and also just for all that you do for our community and for cancer care in general over your career and over, what you give through that. So we appreciate it. Our clients appreciate it. And of course, you're just fun people to talk to too.
thank you for having us. It's been great.
Yes,
Thank you,
thank you very
Julie.
much.
So I will just remind people that you can find this interview if you want to share it with people, others who might be interested. You can find it on Cancer Services website, and you can also find other expert interviews at cancerservicesonline.org/experts, or if you are listening to the audio from the podcast, the Triad Cancer Connection podcast, you can also find the recorded interviews from our other experts there. So I appreciate you all listening, and we hope to see you again soon. And if you have any ideas on future topics, please let me know.